Children are central to the Catholic community. They are the young church of today and her future leaders. We at Awake wanted to have a conversation that considers the many complexities of sharing the Catholic faith with our young people, given the shadow of sexual abuse and its cover up. How do we talk about the problem of sexual abuse with children? What do they need to know to keep their bodies safe? How do we create safe, open environments for them to practice the faith? And how do we include children in the work of building a compassionate church that is safe for all? So now I'm honored to introduce our three panelists. First, I'd like to welcome Mike Hoffman, who is joining us today from Chicago. Mike and his wife, Kathy, have a daughter and a son who are in their 20s, and Mike is a survivor of abuse by a parish priest, which began when Mike was a 12-year-old altar boy and continued for more than 3 years. Today, Mike and his wife, Kathy, are committed members of St. Mary of the Woods Parish in Chicago, and Mike is also chair of the Hope and Healing Committee of the Archdiocese of Chicago. This is a group of clergy abuse survivors, priests, and staff from the Archdiocese who reach out to survivors of abuse seeking help to heal from the pain. He is also a member of Awake's Survivor Advisory Panel and recently spoke at the National Catholic Conference on Restorative Justice in Minneapolis. We are honored to have you with us today, Mike. We're also joined by Regina Boyd, a licensed mental health counselor and marriage and family therapist based near Orlando, Florida. Her clients include survivors of trauma and sexual abuse, as well as clergy abuse, and in a previous role, she was a campus ministry counselor for a Catholic high school in the Diocese of Orlando. Regina joined us for a previous Courageous conversation on the topic of trauma, and she also recently spoke at the National Catholic Conference on Restorative Justice. Regina and her husband, Daniel, are the parents to a 6-year-old daughter. Thank you for joining us today, Regina. Finally, I'd like to welcome Marcus Mescher, Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Xavier University in Cincinnati. Marcus is a Milwaukee native who has worked in parish youth ministry and college campus ministry for 10 years. Marcus has spent the last several years researching the psychological, spiritual, moral, and social dimensions of harm caused by clergy sexual abuse. Some of you may be familiar with his presentations and writing on moral injury, including several posts on the Awake blog. Marcus and his spouse, Anne, are parents to 3 children, ages 14, 10, and 5. We're pleased to welcome you again, Marcus. So let's begin our conversation. We'll now turn to Mary Gentile, a member of Awake's leadership team and Courageous Conversations team, who is also a wife, mother of 3, and a high school theology teacher. Mary will be moderating our conversation today.
Thank you, Catherine. Let me just echo your warm welcome to everyone gathered here today. So as Catherine said, I'm a longtime educator. I'm also the spouse of an educator and a mother of 3, and God willing, a grandmother at some point in the future. So this is a conversation that I have been anxious to have, and I am honored to lead. Our team at Awake for Courageous Conversations, we looked over the registrations form for this event, and I acknowledge there's a lot of folks coming with a wide variety of concerns and questions about this topic. So we're going to do our best to address what we can in the time given. I'm confident that these 3 individuals, Regina, Mike, and Marcus, are going to provide a wealth of wisdom for us, varied, valuable perspectives, and some practical ideas for all of us too. So let's get into it. I'd like to start by giving each of you a chance to share a little bit more about what brings you to this conversation today. Maybe you could tell us just a little more about your families or your engagement with the church or your engagement with youth. But I'm hoping that for a quick introduction, in one sentence, could you answer the question, why did you agree to help us discuss this difficult but really important topic today? So I think I'll start with you, Mike.
Thank you, Mary. It might be 2 sentences.
That's okay. We'll let it go.
I am the clergy sexual abuse survivor when I was a little boy, and we send our children to Catholic schools. And so this is a vitally important topic, and it's something that is deeply personal to us, my wife, Kathy, and I. And I'm thrilled to be on this call with you today.
Thank you, Mike. And again, I'm sorry for your abuse. Let's move to you next, Regina. What brings you to this conversation today? And is there anything else you'd like to share about your background? And you can have more than one sentence too.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I would say that I just care. I care about helping people who are vulnerable, who are hurt. I care about safety and healing. And a little bit of my background, I've done youth ministry, core team volunteering in the past. I used to work for an agency where we did home-based mental health care for youth and their families. So we were working with children in and out of a crisis with their own families, whether they experienced their abuse from their family members or just outside of their homes. And so I think there's just a lot as far as a church that we can do to offer hope and healing to others. And I think that's a huge part of why I'm here today. Also, the work that I've done with survivors, been referred people to work with through our diocese here. And it's a really valuable and important topic.
Thank you. And thanks again, Regina, for being with us. Finally, Marcus, let us know a little bit about what brings you today.
Thanks, Mary. As Catherine mentioned, I'm a native of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and was an altar server for a priest who was credibly accused and I believe admitted to abuse of young boys in my home parish. And that's been something that I've been trying to process throughout my life, but has not been a reason for me to leave the church. I was really involved in my home parish, which is now known as Lumen Christi. It was St. James when I was there up in Milan. And that continued throughout high school and college, and after college when I became a youth minister for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee at two parishes on the west side. I was youth minister in the years after the Spotlight investigation and the news breaking in Boston, and had to have a lot of conversations with my pastor, with the parish team, with parents, and with youth about how this could have happened and how we make the church a safe place for everyone. And now as a parent, this is a conversation that continues to be really important to me, especially informed by the research that I've been doing over the last several years. We had a survey completed by hundreds of people from across the country, and that included from a number of Catholic university students. And of those students, we had 6 undergraduates who identified themselves to us as survivors of clergy sexual abuse, which was really eye-opening for me to know that this is not just a problem from the past or in places far away, that even in my classroom, there are survivors of clergy sexual abuse. And so I really appreciate that Awake is having this conversation so that we can stay vigilant and ensuring that all church spaces are safe places for everyone, but especially the most vulnerable among us.
Thank you, Marcus. Again, thank you, all 3 of you. I look forward to hearing more about your experiences and your ideas for moving us forward here. Mike, I'm going to turn back to you and ask you, is there a story that you could share with us that helps us understand how your experiences as a victim survivor have shaped the way you've shared the Catholic faith with your children?
Sure, of course. So my wife and I chose to send our kids to Catholic schools despite my abuse, because we feel the values and the faith expressed in Catholic education is what was important to us, and we wanted to pass that along to our children. So one small example of that, in our parish, many of the children, starting in 5th grade, are invited to become altar servers. And so my daughter is older, my son is younger, and this mattered to Kathy and I. And so there's a tradition of kind of going to the first mass when your child is an altar server. And we did that, and we kind of celebrated them. And that's an exciting moment in our home. And at the end of my daughter's first mass, we waited for her, and we, went out to eat breakfast after that. And it was just kind of a moment in our family. And then when my son he's 2 years younger. And so we waited 2 more years. and he became an altar server. And at the end of his first Mass, I was waiting for him in our narthex, and he did a great job. And, we celebrated him just the same. But to share with the community here, my son looks like me and acts like me. And I thought of me, especially when I was on the altar, when I was an altar server. And my experience of altar serving is totally different than my son's experience of altar serving. My particular abuser was the, quote unquote, head of the altar boys. And so that was one pathway for my abuser to gain access to children, me and other boys. So now I can think of that while my son and my daughter are on the altar, but I have to put myself out of it, because this is a wonderful way to pass along our faith in interacting with other parishioners, and other parishioners were excited to have the kids be altar servers too. And so one particular story, at the end of my son's first time, and we're back there and we were happy for him, and he was excited that he did it. He met what I call an older parishioner, a woman who I did not know, but she's one of those daily Mass goers. And she was excited to meet my son and to say thank you to him for putting his time and energy into altar serving. And I take that model to heart. I look at that as a model of passing along the faith. An older parishioner who we don't know and isn't our neighbor was reaching out to my son, and my son had to talk to her. And I think there's something shared there, something special and unique. I call it our faith was shared in that moment. And that's just one example of my wife and I, our attempt to pass along our faith to our children.
Thank you so much, Mike, for giving us that little glimpse into your family's life there, and a moment that clearly was beautiful, but also had its unique challenges for you. I'm going to ask Regina and Marcus, both of you. Let's start with you again, Regina. You've both walked with many survivors. So I'm wondering if you also have a story you could share about how what you've come to know about the realities of sexual abuse by church leaders has shaped your approach to raising your children.
Yeah, I think, just being in this role as a therapist, you hear so many shocking, horrific stories. And I think what has been surprising to me over the years is just how quickly something can happen, how even out in the open, when you appear to be safe around other people, whether it's some type of inappropriate contact or, as somebody's walking by another person, how in a split second something can happen in the middle of Mass when all eyes are on you, right? What is a young person supposed to do in that situation, and how do they respond? And so I've really learned that nowhere is safe, and you just really never know under what circumstances. And I think one thing that has shaped me is just being really attentive to those areas, as a parent, wondering about what are those areas that I don't think about or take for granted. Is there something that I can do to help give my own daughter her own protection, her own sense of autonomy, awareness, safety as preventative measures? So that could be anything from teaching anatomically correct terms for body parts and whatnot, right? She's still pretty young, she's 6. But we know from the research that can be one thing that's helpful and preventative. So yeah, I would say that's a little bit of, she doesn't come out of my supervision too often, but it's really important to still have those conversations about personal space and whatnot.
Thanks, Regina. How about you, Marcus? Why don't you share a story with us, or your sort of feelings about how you approach raising your children in the church?
Yeah, it has certainly been an honor to walk with survivors over the last several years, and I am in awe of what survivors carry. And in a number of interviews that we coordinated through our research project at Xavier, we did qualitative research interviews with survivors to hear about not just what it was like to be abused, but the response from the church after the abuse. And in almost every case, survivors told us that they chose not to tell their parents about their abuse. And they most commonly listed 3 reasons. The first one was that they didn't think they would be believed, that they were just a child, that they didn't think that their word would count for anything in the eyes of adults, and certainly not against the word of a priest. The second was that they were worried about getting this priest in trouble because of the ways that we are all programmed, both in a healthy way, but in an unhealthy way through clericalism, to put priests up on a pedestal, or to treat them with reverence and to be deferential. That there was this huge fear that saying anything that could get someone that these children had seen. These were respected figures in the community, and so they were afraid of the consequences of getting that priest in trouble. And then the third reason, and I think this is the most heartbreaking for me, especially as a parent, is that many survivors told us that they didn't tell their parents about their abuse because they thought it would break their parents, or it would destroy them, or that they didn't know how on earth their parents would be able to process this information, that the parents would feel like a failure and that they would blame themselves. And so it was really sobering to see these survivors try to protect their parents from the truth, almost playing the parental role by trying to guard their parents from what they were enduring or had endured. And so I think, now that I'm a parent and I have this information, I think I do everything in my power to keep lines of communication open and clear with my children, and to remove all the barriers that would make them nervous or afraid or in any way insecure to tell me about something that they saw or heard, or that they're wrestling with, or that they're unsure about. I just feel like, as a parent now, it is my duty to show up every day and prove to my children that I am a safe person, and that whatever they're dealing with, that I am here to walk with them. That I may not have all the answers, but that we will figure it out together, and that they don't have to be alone in anything that they're wrestling with. Just because in so many cases, the abuse brings about these feelings of stigma and shame and isolation. And so I think the proactive move there is to try to do whatever we can to dismantle those beliefs and practices, or the kinds of relationships that contribute to stigma or shame or isolation.
Thank you. A lot of good things to begin to think about from all 3 of you. And I think we'll come back to talking about some of these ways that we work with kids differently in light of this. But before we do that, Mike, I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about your experiences working with the folks who put together the Virtus training videos and materials that are used throughout the U.S. in safeguarding efforts. For the benefit of people who might not know, could you just provide a quick overview of the rules and guidelines for safeguarding in the church today?
Yes, of course. I'm
Thanks.
glad you asked. If any volunteer, parent, or employed staff, or teacher, or priest has contact with children, they are required to participate in the Virtus Protecting God's Children program. And that is at this point, it's a best practice in child safety led by a facilitator with the campus community to inform the parents and staff, et cetera, about grooming behaviors, no matter who the perpetrator is, not simply any clergy person, but grooming behaviors, and how children are affected by the community grooming and things like that that Regina and Marcus had just kind of alluded to. I participated in this since I had come forward with my story in the Archdiocese of Chicago in 2006. My children were younger, and I wanted to volunteer on campus. I think it's one of the wonderful things that is a part of campus life at your parish or in a religious education program. You can volunteer and be with your children and see them socialize and be a part of that. And I did that. And even as an abuse survivor, I had to do the Virtus Protecting God's Children program. And I sat in the class. I thought it was run very, very well, Mary, better than I anticipated, to be honest with you. And I participated in that. And then I remember there was a time we had a group discussion. And the gentleman sitting right next to me in the group discussion, we just watched a movie. He had said, no, he was struggling. He said, no, that boy in the movie looks weak, and my boys aren't weak. And I was sitting right next to him, and he sings in the choir on Sunday. I mean, he's a friend. And I folded my hands and I just heard this information. I wasn't going to tell him my story. I didn't tell him my story. But he was blaming the child for the abuse that was being described on the movie. And those feelings are still kind of a general feeling out in our society, that the child is blamed for the abuse. I certainly felt when I was abused, maybe I did something to cause my abuser to do these things to me. And obviously, the child is never, ever to blame in cases of abuse. And so I found this experience, it's very complicated for me, but I found it to be helpful because I was surrounded by others in the community who are participating in what I call a minimum standard of child safety. And I feel the Virtus program, Protecting God's Children, did a very good job. Later in my life, my children are now out of the Catholic schools. I became involved in the movie itself. I had offered my services because they were using an actor as a survivor. And I feel that this role should not be done by an actor, and that an actual survivor of clergy abuse should be in the role. Now, it doesn't have to be me. It could be any survivor. There are many survivors, but they had asked me if I was willing to do it, and I agreed to do it. And so, yes, I am a part of the movie Protecting God's Children that is utilized throughout the United States.
Oh my goodness, thank you for that story. I hadn't heard that before, Mike, and I think it's just such an important reminder to all of us of how important it is to have conversations, right? So to sort of dismantle those false beliefs that are out there. As parents and educators, anyone working with youth, I think it's important that we know what the archdiocesan guidelines are. And they're posted on websites, in every archdiocese. So it's good to remind folks to take the time, regardless of whether they're working with youth or not. Of course, if you're working with youth, you're going to be required to do it, right?
Well, if you don't mind, I've got another story. My daughter is now the head coach of the softball program. I'm very proud, but she's the head coach of the softball program at DePaul College Prep. It's a Catholic school here in Chicago. She had to participate in Virtus. So if you put yourself in my shoes, think of the generational aspect. My parents didn't have resources to protect children. Clearly they needed them. My wife and I had resources to protect our children, and we did all that we can. And now my daughter, who is 26 years old, she has now been Virtus trained, and she can do what she can to protect children in her program. I consider, it's a beautiful thing, and it speaks to the generational aspect of this abuse crisis in our church. I find hope in the fact that my daughter has now participated in Virtus.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah. So as you said, it is required. Different archdioceses deal with it in different ways. So how it is applied varies. We need to be aware of that. And, thinking back to some of the responses to the last question, like Regina said, things can happen quickly. And so we have this need to be vigilant, to help our children be vigilant as well. When we met together to prepare for today, the four of us, we talked about the need for parents and educators and all people working with children to find a balance, right, between the extremes of naive trust and hypervigilance that might breed fear or rejection. In a sense, I think we're trying to balance our hopes and fears. So I'm wondering if I could turn back to you, Regina, with the question, do you think it's important to have direct conversations with our children about the realities of sexual abuse? And what other strategies would you recommend for achieving that balance between trust and vigilance?
Yes, I do think it's very important to have direct conversations, because kind of to what Marcus was illustrating earlier, it demonstrates that this is an open door for conversation. It shows that you're comfortable having the conversations, taking age into account, but we have to start somewhere. And so I think it's very important to have the direct conversations when a child is young, thinking about a healthy relationship, talking about what a healthy, respectful relationship looks like. What are the good things that happen in a lasting relationship? Feeling loved, having shared, treasured moments together, good memories. And you could add pieces about, sometimes relationships make people feel uncomfortable, unsafe, bullied, and these things are not okay. There's lots of children's books out that people can read to younger children about, my body belongs to me, or some secrets should never be kept, to really illustrate these things. One story I think I shared when we were planning, my daughter, we have these conversations, and she was watching something on TV where there was a baby in a doctor's office, and a pediatrician, the baby was in the diaper, and she yells, she's like, inappropriate, and so we had this opportunity to discuss, well, the baby is with their mom and dad, and this is a doctor who's going to examine, and so the baby is safe, and talk. So just using any opportunity to really have that educational moment. You can do that with older kids as well. If there's something that happened in the news or the media, taking advantage of that opportunity to have those conversations with your kids. I think the trainings are really important because a lot of our young people are getting those safe environment trainings when they're in school or in their faith formation classes as well. And so asking what were you taught in school, and using that as a starting point. And like I said, thinking of it as an ongoing conversation. We don't have to sit down and have one big talk with someone, but understanding this is something you're going to revisit several times over the years. Letting kids know about boundaries, being uncomfortable. And then I think even just in a practical sense in your own home, how are boundaries respected in your own home and in your own family? Are we, we want to say something to our kids and we just walk on in the room without knocking first, right? Because I'm the adult, I'm in charge, or just we don't think about it. We love our kids and we want to be near them and spend time with them. But are we taking that time to really establish that there are boundaries that people shouldn't just be haphazardly crossing? That was something I had to learn after potty training and whatnot, that, okay, she's got this under control. I don't need to be hovering in the bathroom anymore, right? It's starting to be inappropriate. And so letting her know that that's her private time to be in the restroom and whatnot. And so I think there's lots of ways that we can convey these messages, directly and indirectly as well.
Thank you. A lot of good ideas there shared, Regina. Let's turn to you now, Marcus. Have you mentioned talking, being a open and safe, place for your kids to come to, but I'm wondering, have you had direct conversations about the topic with your children? And then do you have any other parenting practices you'd recommend for again, achieving this balance between trust and vigilance?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be real clear that child abuse is a huge problem and not just one in the Catholic Church. You know, we know statistically that something like 1 in 7 children will endure abuse or neglect in our country, and that's likely a terrible underestimate, just because of how so many cases just never see the light of day and never get reported. Um, on average, um, for every case that comes to light, there are 60 cases that never get reported. And when we're talking about clergy sexual abuse, on average, the priest perpetrator is responsible for 285 offenses. And so this is a problem all over, and it's not restricted to the United States or not restricted to the Catholic Church. But I have to say, my entire life of being a practicing Catholic, I've never heard a single homily about child abuse or how this is a social problem that we have to address by virtue of trying to be like Jesus in the world, as an expression of Christian discipleship. And so I would affirm what Regina said. I certainly have taken this to heart as something that I talk about with my children, to talk about ways that they should find and lift their voice if there's something they're uncomfortable with, that we need to have healthy boundaries. The two things that I think are worth adding to what Regina already said is the first, we live in a world that just everything runs on feeding on our insecurities, right? Like every ad you have ever seen has tried to convince you that you are not enough. And so you need this product as an escape or as a release or to compensate, right? Like we live in a very toxic culture that makes it harder and harder for us to see that we are created in the image and likeness of God. At Xavier, I actually make my students, I shouldn't say make them, I invite them to write very good on the palm of their hands in pen after we read the first book of Genesis together, where God creates everything and it is very good, and that they are part of that very goodness. And in too many cases, at the end of the semester, when my students are evaluating the course, that practice of writing very good on the palm of their hand and seeing it throughout the day, or having a friend ask them, what does it mean? That stays with them more than anything that I talk about over the course of the next 15 weeks, because they have so many reasons not to believe that they are good or that they are good enough. And so I think all of us really can do a much better job of sending home the message to our children that they are a reflection of the divine, and so is everyone else that they encounter. And so right now, actually, my 5-year-old daughter, Grace, is dealing with a boy who's making very poor choices on the playground, and he's hit her and kicked her and thrown a soccer ball at her head. And he's starting to pick out on other girls in the class too. And so every day it's a reminder of the conversation that she does not deserve to be mistreated, and neither does her friend. And that she has to see herself as an advocate and as an ally for others. And so I think that would be the second piece that I would add to what Regina shared is I think we, in addition to living in a really toxic culture that makes us all think that we are not enough, or, that we struggle with a sense of shame or just not measuring up. I think too, we live in a hyper individualistic society where we just kind of shrink our moral concern to, I do me, you do you, this live and let live, which just as easily becomes live and let suffer, or even live and let die, right? It's just this radical non-judgmentalism where tolerance is the greatest good, but tolerance doesn't actually make us interrupt systems that degrade or deprive or oppress, or that silence or that shame. And so I think what we really need, and speaking as a Catholic moral theologian, I think I know that this is an uphill battle in our hyper-individualistic society, but we need a more robust sense of solidarity, that it's not just a concern for my kids or your kids, but our kids, and to see that our kids is an umbrella that leaves out no one. And so that's I think the challenge that we really need to deliver on at the local level, to figure out how do we have a more comprehensive concern. So it's not just a matter of parents having this conversation with their children, or a pastoral minister having conversation with the people who are in their program, but to really try to make this a conversation that we can have as a community with as many community partners as we can find, to ensure not just that my home or my parish is a safe place, but that our neighborhood, our community is a place where we ensure that everyone knows of their innate and infinite goodness, and that we create the conditions for mutual respect and a robust co-responsibility, where we see ourselves really, shouldering this responsibility to make, communities safe, that we're standing shoulder to shoulder, and it's not, not the job of the VAC or, this person who's getting a paycheck, but all of us together.
Thank you, Marcus. Couple reminders of some of those core ideas from our Catholic social teaching, and also of challenges, societal challenges related to this that, add to this particular challenge. Before I turn to you, Mike, to give us a response to this same question, just want to remind everyone that we do invite audience questions, right? And Catherine talked about that at the intro. So again, you'll see that you can send questions to Catherine there in the chat box. And we're going to save some space at the end here to have your questions answered by these folks. So Mike, I'm turning to you now. Have you had conversations with your children, and what other parenting practices can you recommend?
Well, yes. So, given my abuse in my history, and I've been rather public about it, my kids and I and my wife, we've had various discussions. Regina mentioned it earlier, kind of age appropriate discussions. So when the kids were littler, one of the things that I do is in our community, it's a healing, therapeutic healing effort for me to plant pinwheels for child abuse prevention. And the pinwheels at our parish, and the pinwheels come in two separate boxes. The sticks come in one box, and the pinwheel itself comes in another box, and you have to assemble the pinwheels. And so what we would do, my wife and I would assemble these pinwheels, and then the kids would see these pinwheels on our dining room table and go, "What is this for? Why are we doing this?" And that was a moment for me to say, I was hurt by a very bad man when I was your age. And now we're raising awareness that all children deserve to be protected now at our local school. So all the kids in your class and all the kids of our whole parish should be protected. And we're going to plant this pinwheel to do that. And they thought, well, gee, isn't that a wonderful thing? And so that was our kind of methodology to kind of introduce, my story and the idea of safety in their lives at an age appropriate way. And then when they were in high school, the discussion changes, and they learned a little bit more about me and my story. And then now in their 20s, we don't talk about acts of abuse or anything, but they know my story, and I've been certainly forthcoming, and we know we're trying to protect the children, but also be a better church. And that's how I phrase it with our kids at our dinner table. And I certainly concur with Marcus and Regina and how they've shared their stories as well.
Thanks. Mike, I remember when we met too, you talked a little bit about sort of a general practice at your dinner table of just inviting kids to share whatever concerns they have. You want to tell us a little more about that?
Sure, thank you. No, I call it explicit permission to say what's on your mind, and that your mom and dad can handle it. And don't worry if there's a swear word. Don't worry if it's a boy looked at me funny, or that you don't even know exactly what to say, but try to say something, because we can't help you if we don't know about it. And so like Regina had said, that this is many years. This is something that we have to do over time. but it's allowing the kids explicit permission to say what's on their mind. Honestly, when I was a little boy, I didn't have this kind of permission in my house. My mother would never hear it. And I'm trying to take that to heart and allow our kids and all kids, they should have permission to tell their parents or any trusted, safe adult what happened to them.
So important. And, as Marcus said earlier too, he found that same thing in his research, what you experienced there as well. I've gained from all three of you a lot of really great practical strategies. I'm definitely going to steal your practice, Marcus, in my classroom of when we read Genesis, having them write that on their hand. I think that's beautiful. So I'll carry that into my classroom as well. We've talked a lot about protecting our kids, ensuring they're safe in a safe environment, I guess. But I think there's an even more fundamental challenge to raising children in a morally injured institution. Now, Marcus, I know you've thought a lot about this as you're writing a book on moral injury in the church. So could you begin by answering that question of how do you approach this particular challenge, the challenge of just, raising our kids in an institution that has suffered moral injury?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Just a quick definition. So moral injury is caused by profound betrayal that leads to confusion and disorientation, persistent psychological distress, spiritual anguish, moral disorientation, embodied trauma, and social isolation. And I think it's a really helpful just lens to understand the fallout, like, to think of clergy sexual abuse like a bomb has gone off and then there's a blast radius, and to understand that the harm is going to be most acute with survivors. And yet there is harm that other people carry, the loved ones of survivors who feel like maybe they should have done something, all the adults who probably saw something that was wrong, a parish secretary, a janitor, other adults who seemed like to observe that something was off between this relationship between the priest and a child, or a priest and another adult, but just kept quiet because they thought it was best to mind their own business. And a betrayal that a lot of us who are lay Catholics carry. How could this have happened in an institution that is just in our DNA, right? Like I could never leave the church because being Catholic is just, it's in the marrow of my bones. But I still do feel a sense of betrayal, not just at what these perpetrators did, but at what so many church officials concealed and covered up, and all the ways that they shielded perpetrators and silenced victims. And then you do have a whole number of former Catholics. There's more than 30 million Americans who identify as former Catholics. And I would say a lot of them also carry some degree of moral injury to say, I don't want to identify with this institution any longer. And we know this is actually really acute with our young people. In general, for every person who joins the Catholic Church, 6.5 leave. And more than 80% leave before age 22. So they make a decision very young that they don't want anything to do with this institution any longer. And this is part of a larger trend of disaffiliation, not just with religious institutions, but just a distrust for institutions in general. You think about, for example, the murder of George Floyd and all that we're coming to see now about the ways in which law enforcement have abused their power, and it has resulted in the death of unarmed civilians like Breonna Taylor sleeping in her own bed, or Philandro Castile, in his own vehicle, right? And so our young people, I think, have their antenna up for hypocrisy and corruption and abuse of power. And so I think these are actually really good things, and that can be kind of the entry point to acknowledge that with great power comes great responsibility. And If you have people who see something as wrong and who look the other way or who stay silent, that's a problem. And it's not just a problem of a few bad apples. It's a systemic and a structural problem. And at the same time, right, like we're dealing with human institutions, and humans are sinful, and there's no perfect society, right? Like there's no place we can go and we would not experience betrayal, or that we would not experience an abuse of trust, or any other experience of harm. And so I think while we have to acknowledge this profound betrayal and the harm that it has caused so many people, I think we also then, at the very same time, have to roll up our sleeves and say, this will only continue unless and until we get involved and we do something to try to ensure a different exercise of power, one that does not prey on vulnerable people. And we know statistically, when it comes to clergy sexual abuse, that predators prey on the most vulnerable members of a community, whether it's by age or physical disability, whether it's by race or gender or legal status, even sexual orientation. I've met so many survivors who, because they were queer, they didn't know how to talk about their abuse, because then they would have to also talk about their sexual orientation. And there's so much shame and stigma around human sexuality, especially when it's outside of a heteronormative framework or a marital framework. And so I think, we've got to confront the moral injury head on, but then also, see ourselves as having some skin in the game in doing the repair work that's necessary, that in the wake of losing this sense of safety and trust, the way to rebuild that is by showing people in a sustained way genuine concern, drawing near to the people who are hurting, listening them, making sure that they feel believed, that they feel understood and cared for, and that they feel supported. And so, I think all of us have work that we can do. And this is the charge that I give my students, to try to model that deep and authentic listening without judgment, or without the victim blaming that Mike illustrated for us. But then also modeling that genuine concern that shows that, we really do care for people, and that we will continue to show up for them over the long haul.
Thank you so much, Marcus. You brought up an important point of how it's not just about abuse of children, right? But any vulnerable folks, including adults who are suffering from abuse as well. Mike, on that note, you have adult children who identify as Catholic. What are your feelings about them being part of this church where you experienced abuse?
Thank you for asking. It's complicated in my house. Right now, the children they're adult children. And so, they're creasters, Christmas and Easters. If their boyfriend or girlfriend is going to church, they may tag along. Things like that is kind of their practice now. I'll share with the community, I've said to the kids, listen, no one should have to ever obviously endure what I and other survivors have had to endure. And so don't entirely place your entire experience on me and my experience here. I want you, there's so much here in our these are my words to my children. There's so much here that, the church will be there when you need it. And so I remind them that they are Catholic, they are baptized, they are all their sacraments, and that's important. I discussed this recently on the death of my mother. We had a Catholic funeral, and that was a moment to share the language of grieving and share how we grieve as a family, and that is vital. That is important to me and to them. They appreciated they didn't know how to process all that grieving until they could participate in grieving as a family in our Catholic funeral and what we did to bury my mother. And so there's a role for the Catholic faith for the kids right now. They're feeling it, like Marcus. There's a massive moral injury, and they are smart. But I did remind them, they are Catholic, and it'll be there when you want it to be there.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to go to a topic that was touched on briefly. I think Marcus mentioned the problem of clericalism in our church, the ways that priests and deacons hold particular power and privilege. You know, some folks suggest that placing priests on pedestals can set the stage for abuse. So I actually like to hear what Regina would have to say about how we encourage healthy and appropriate relationships, because you talked a little bit about healthy relationships too, Regina. So I think Matt, I would like to hear from you. How do we encourage healthy and appropriate relationships between priests, deacons, and our children and families?
Yeah, I think recognizing power and privilege is an important first step. So anyone who's in that position of power, are you aware of that power? Because we can't be deferential or balanced in that unless we're aware of how people are just naturally going to defer to, yes, Father, whatever you say, or yes, whoever the administrator is, youth minister, right? Whoever has that position of authority. And so one, we have to be aware of what's the power dynamic in this relationship and the interactions I'm having with this person in front of me. And am I honest about that being there? Because if we say, oh, no, it's fine, I treat everyone the same, then we're not really being honest about the dynamic and what's happening. So awareness is key. But then thinking about how you relate to those individuals. How do you relate to other people who are in positions of authority? What are you teaching children about respecting people in a position of authority? Are we saying things like, listen to adults, a blanket statement of listen to whatever anyone tells you is not necessarily helpful, as opposed to, is what this person is teaching you or trying to say helpful, kind, safe, those types of things, helping them to think through, is this something I should be listening to or not? So I think we can model that as well in just simple things. With younger children, I think it's very common to feel that pressure, right? We're trying to teach young children manners. And so when they're saying hello or goodbye to a priest, to a family member, we say, hug, make sure you say goodbye to Father, hug, give him a hug. And remembering that it's okay to not do that. And so you can teach your children to ask permission, at the end of a play date or something, right? Ask your friend, is it okay if I give you a hug? Do you want a hug right now? Or teaching children, saying if a parent is pressuring a child to say goodbye to you, you can take it upon yourself to say, I like to give high fives. I can give a wave, a fist bump, or nothing at all. It's okay. You don't have to hug me, to give the child really permission to practice getting in touch with their own comfort levels and what it is they want to be expressing in any given moment. So I think the more that we can model that as adults in our own conversations about, behind closed doors, what are you saying in front of your children about somebody's authority, and when are appropriate ways to defer and when not to, I think that can be really helpful.
Thanks. Either Mike or Marcus, do you want to add anything on this topic of clericalism before we move on? I do want to get to audience questions pretty soon, so this is one final reminder to the audience to get any questions that you have over to us as well now. But then Mike or Marcus, anything to add on this topic of clericalism?
I want our priests to be the best priests that they can be. I call it a glorious ministry. However, that should be done in a spirit of openness, accountability, transparency, disclosure. And that's what I want to say.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Regina said about all of us being on guard against clericalism. Sometimes you see it in a priest who is kind of in love with being the center of attention, or being the person who gets to make the decisions at a particular parish. But I also, especially when I worked as a youth minister in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, I also saw it a lot in lay people who just adopt a very deferential position. The father knows best, and I, in the survivors that I accompanied, I heard over and over again that one of the reasons why they trusted priests and let priests cross boundaries, or that they didn't recognize the grooming behavior, was because they thought that priests couldn't sin, or that the priest was the closest thing that they would ever encounter to God. Or in the words of one survivor from the west side of Cincinnati, he said he was raised to believe that the only person on this planet higher than a police officer was a priest. And when we see anyone with unchecked power or as an absolute authority, that's not healthy, not for any human being, not for any institution. And so I think clericalism, it's something that Pope Francis actually just announced at the Synod last week, is something that we all have to really confront in our own way, by making sure that we're not playing into it either, and trying to see that, by virtue of baptism, we are all equal members of the church, right? We're all baptized as priest, prophet, and king. So we all need to embrace that baptismal vocation.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. I am going to turn now to the audience questions. We've had quite a few come in, and I got a couple here for sure that I want to ask, and see if I can make some room for more after that. So the first question is about the safeguarding training. So Mike, you spoke very positively of that current safeguarding training offered in your diocese. But Awake has also heard from people who have found safe environment trainings problematic or inadequate in many ways. Is there a risk, do you think, of making this one-time class, sort of this is enough to prevent all abuse? And are there other things we should be doing as a church to bring deeper awareness and greater safety? So why don't we start with you, Mike, and then if Marcus or Regina have anything to add, they could.
Well, sure. No, for sake of this discussion, I presented it as a one-time class, but it's not. There are monthly bulletins, and then you need to re-attend the class. I think it's after 4 years. It could be 5 years. I'd have to check. And then there are background checks, and there are codes of conduct, and there's so many more layers to it. So the overriding idea is correct. These things are obviously only as good as it's implemented and consistently implemented over time. And so in certain parishes, it may be really, really wonderful. And in certain other parishes or other dioceses, it is not wonderful. And so that's reflective of that local diocese. I don't think it's necessarily reflective of the program itself. So I have experiences. I mean, the team needs to take it seriously. And if you take it seriously, it's a good program. And like anything in life, if you don't do it right and take it seriously, it's probably not worth the paper that it's printed on.
Yeah. So, and you're speaking about your diocese, Mike. So I think, that may not necessarily, what you're describing in terms of how that is handled may be particular to your diocese. There may be a lot of places where, it's just a one-time class, and then, it's kind of put on a shelf and people are done with it. I also, before seeing if Marcus or Regina, you have anything to say to this, just want to acknowledge again that abuse is happening to adults. It happens to adults. And even though that's not the focus of this event, I think it's important that we remember, that some of these programs may overlook that as well. But Regina, Marcus, do you have anything to add about your thoughts on the safeguarding initiatives in the church?
Well, I'm glad you said what you just did, Mary, about how we can't only focus on children or assume that this is a problem where, we have predators who are preying only on children. Since Awake has started sharing my research, I've actually been hearing more from adults than from survivors of childhood sexual abuse, including a lot of women religious who really just feel totally invisible and who have no voice or agency in trying to bring to light. Because they're over 18, everyone assumes that anything that happens is consensual. And I think going back to what Regina said about clericalism, those vows and the way that we treat priests, it creates an asymmetry in power, and we really got to be vigilant against the way that asymmetry in power can be used to coerce or control or otherwise manipulate or dominate people.
Mhm.
I would say from my experience here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, we have moved away from Virtus training and we now use safe parish training. And I would say, at least based on what I've seen so far, it is an improvement on Virtus. I went through the Virtus training when I was a youth minister in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and safe parish does seem to expand the scope beyond clergy sexual abuse or only looking at, making sure the parish is a safe place. But those bulletins run the gamut of a whole number of ways in which marginalized children and adults can be subject to sexual exploitation or coercion. And so I think, like Mike said, right? Like this is like anything in life, you get out of it what you put into it. The trick there is that it's really easy to, take the quiz or, ignore the video while it's playing. And so that was going to be actually something that I wanted to talk about in my action step at the end is how do we raise the bar so that we're not just aiming for the minimum standard to say I've got the certificate or that I'm current with my training, but we actually look for more ways to look for the gaps in people's awareness or in what's impeding people to speak up or to act as an advocate or as an ally for anyone who might be vulnerable.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus.
Regina,
if you want to add,
just quickly, the only thing I would add is, again, thinking internally, especially if we're staff members in a parish or in a diocese, thinking about our motivation behind our responses. So are we more motivated by protecting against liability, or are we motivated by the heart of Christ and what is the right thing to do in this situation and caring for the vulnerable? And so I think when we think about our duty as Christians, that can be a really good guide on what we should be doing in those situations and how to respond.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions here. And so the next one here is about priests being sometimes reluctant to engage with clerical abuse. It seems easier sometimes for them to frame it as the bad apples and that kind of thing. But there's a powerful role for priests to create spaces for honest discussions about what has already happened and for guarding against abuses of power. And so this audience question asks, what examples have speakers seen of church leaders helping to create those spaces, or of survivors getting clergy to become more helpful or less defensive? I wonder, really, any of you want to jump in on that?
I wish there were more positive examples of clergy really being courageous. I do know, having been the product of Catholic education all the way from K4 through my PhD, and having a lot of priests as my teachers and professors and classmates, that this is a very hard topic to talk about. And I imagine there is an immense amount of moral injury carried by clergy at what their brothers did or concealed. And so I'm sure this is not easy. My best friend happens to be a priest. We met our first day of high school at Marquette High and went through Marquette High and Marquette U together. He stood up in my wedding. He's my eldest son's godfather. He baptized our daughter and gave our middle son his first communion. And so I think making them as fully human as possible has been really important, that we don't just see them through the lens of their clerics or the collar that they wear, or only see them at Mass. And so one of the things that I've tried to do with my children is for them to see Godfather Joe as a full human person, and talking about, the silly or even the stupid things that we did when we were teenagers, or having them come over and letting them see the way that he interacts outside of celebrating Mass, and to get to know him as a full human being. And so I think priests can do this. I know that they are stretched really thin, that we are facing a real shortage in the Catholic Church. And so many of them are trying to cover ground at a number of different parish centers and trying to ensure access to the sacramental life for Catholics. And so this is not easy to show up as a full person and to just be with people. But I think this goes back to what Pope Francis talks about with, being shepherds who smell like their sheep. I took students down to El Salvador this past March over spring break, and we got to visit the home of Oscar Romero. And one of my favorite pictures of any person, much less a saint, is a picture of Oscar Romero as Archbishop of San Salvador, sitting on the grass with a bunch of people on the side of the road with a tortilla in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other hand, just shooting the breeze with people of God. His shirt is unbuttoned, his clerical collar, the tab is off to the side, and he's just a shepherd who smells like his sheep, and I think that's important. I will say I think it is a challenge. When we did our survey of moral injury in 2021 and 2022, one of our subjects of study were people who were current or former church employees, and it was nearly impossible to get responses from current or former church employees. And a lot of people told us they were afraid of what their pastor would say if they knew that they participated, even though this participation was entirely anonymous. So there is still a lot of fear, I think, between pastors and their staff, pastors and the lay faithful. And so we've got a lot of work to do to try to dismantle I don't know if it's the secrecy, and we don't really know much about the lives of priests, or just the fear of disappointing them, or of looking like we're not measuring up like good Catholics in the eye of priests, or whatever it is. But we've got a lot of work to do. And I will say, really, the only good example that I can lift up is Bishop John Stowe in Lexington, Kentucky. If it weren't for him, I don't think I would have had any responses from clergy or from parish staff. And he is someone who is awfully prophetic on nonviolence, on caring for LGBTQ members of the Catholic community, on a whole host of issues. And I wish we had more priests and bishops who would adopt that prophetic posture. But I know that's hard, when you're worried about the bottom line or the collection plate. But I do think, what Regina said was really beautiful and inspiring, that we have to keep our eyes on Jesus, right? And we have to try to embrace Jesus' heart and make that our focal goal. And Jesus was someone who was not interested in being served. He was not interested in accumulating power or prestige. He went to the outcast. He drew near the children and to women who had zero social status. And by drawing near to those people on the margins, he empowered them. And so I hope that if a priest is listening to this, that they're looking for those ways to emulate that example of Christ by drawing near those who might feel invisible or insignificant in our church.
Thank you. Thank you. I have one question from the audience that I'd like to direct just to Regina really quick. And then I have one more question that I'm hoping all of you can weigh in on very briefly, because we're getting close to time, and we like to end on time here. So Regina, can you share anything about what you've taught your kids about boundaries and keeping their bodies safe? For example, specific words and phrases that you've used. I think that could be helpful to a lot of our listeners.
Sure. So like I said before, we've read a lot of books about boundaries and whatnot. So one of the things, like I said, when she was watching that video, inappropriate, that's just, I think I didn't mean for it to be a buzzword, but it sort of has turned into one where she's just latched onto that word and will point out things. So I'm kind of rolling with it. It's not necessarily the language I would use. But some of the things we talk about are respect and love, comfortable. How comfortable do you feel? What's your personal space? I'm trying to think of other things, and also thinking about when to say no, how to say stop, or to let somebody know I'm uncomfortable with something, I think is really important. So we've practiced putting our arm up and putting our hand up and saying no, stop. We've practiced, running away. We've practiced all kinds of things. And she thinks it's funny. She thinks it's a game. And so it's a good opportunity to learn and to take advantage, I guess, of this developmental stage of where she's at, of incorporating some of those lessons. And we've talked about privacy, bathing suit areas versus not. So that's a good explanation versus, the doctor is allowed to see certain parts with the parent there versus, not no parent being present. So that's a little bit of where we've gone so far.
Great. Thanks, Regina. That's helpful.
Mhm.
Okay, so my final question references Pope Francis's exhortation that he wrote on youth. And in that, he reminds us all of us, both adults and the youth that he's speaking to, that youth are not the future of the church, but the now of the church. And so, in light of this issue, how might children and youth help us be a better church in response to this issue? So if you could each give just a very quick response to that, something that jumps out at you. Do you want to start, Regina?
Sure. I think ask their opinions. Our kids usually have helpful and thoughtful things to say and contribute. I think we just get lost in the hustle and bustle of things. It's hard to slow down. So letting them know their opinions matter, that they're valued, just by simply asking how they feel about a situation or what they think. And I think going back to that theme of being believed, it's the number one predictor of someone's growth and healing process after abuse is, the people they choose to tell. Do they feel believed in those early stages when they first tell? And so again, as an adult, being prepared to be the potential recipient of news and information and having that disposition of respect, of care, concern, and receptivity.
Thanks. Mike, any thoughts on that?
I go where Regina said. The kids I call them kids. Our young adults are very smart, and we would ask them how are they feeling, their thoughts, and then listen to them. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Mike. And then Marcus, what are your thoughts on this before we turn it over to our closing with Anselma?
My favorite part about being a college professor is the time in the classroom with my students. I get so much energy from them. They really care about the state of the world, whether it's climate collapse or racial justice or respecting the dignity and rights of all people, including in the LGBTQ community. And I see a lot of hope, and I get a lot of hope from them. And hope is not superficial optimism, like everything will be fine or things will get better or that progress is inevitable. Hope is a conviction that there is good worth struggling for. And so I think the more that we accompany and listen to our young people, the more that we can be filled with hope, including for our institution, the Catholic Church.
Well, thank you very much. Hope is a good place for us to end, or at least pause. And Selma is going to do some closing announcements for us now, and then come back and ask each of you one final question. It's really been a pleasure talking to all of you. I have so many things, took so many notes on many practical things to do, and I'm feeling pretty inspired. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Mary, thank you, panelists. As a mother of three, and we've had our own go-rounds in the church about all these things. This was just so rich for me, so thank you. So hello to everybody. My name is Anselma Dulcich Ashley. I'm a member of the Courageous Conversation Planning Team, and I'm a committed volunteer for Awake. One intention with the Courageous Conversation series is for the conversation to lead us toward personal action. So in a few moments, I will invite our panelists back on screen to share some specific action steps that they recommend. But first, let me share some important announcements. Our next Courageous Conversation will help us to understand sexual abuse perpetrated by church leaders in immigrant communities. We'll be joined by Catholic theologian Susan Bigelow Reynolds from Emory University, along with some other special guests that we will be announcing soon. This conversation will take place Thursday, January 11 at noon Central Time. So please watch for more details. Also, please mark your calendar for our Advent mini retreat, which will be called Breathe, and will be based on beautiful prayers written by, there we have it, on the screen. Just a second. Yeah, excellent. Thank you for putting that up. By Cole Arthur Riley as part of her Black Liturgies initiative. We'll have an in-person gathering on the morning of Saturday, December 2, for those in Milwaukee, and the following day, December 3, we'll have a Zoom gathering in the evening for those who wish to join us remotely. You can find more details and sign up to attend on the Awake website. Finally, later today, we will send you a follow-up email that will include a feedback survey that is really important for us to help meet the needs of this group, so please fill it out. There will also be registration for part 2 of this courageous conversation, which will be held in the evening next week, next Thursday, November 9th. We invite you to join us Thursday, November 9 at 7 p.m. Central to discuss what you heard today in a small group format. Also, we suggest that you share the recording of this conversation with friends and colleagues who might benefit from it. The recording will be ready and posted in the next day or two. Please watch the website. So at this point, let's turn back briefly to our panelists for some closing thoughts. And the question here is, what actions would you recommend that people take to make the church safe for all? Regina, let's start with you.
If you see something, say something. Hold other people accountable. So if you are in an interaction with a staff member or clergy crossing a boundary, use that as an opportunity to say something to that individual, right? That's what we hear in scripture. If there's disagreement, go to that person first. And just saying that that's uncomfortable, or, that makes me uncomfortable, or you can turn it into a joke, whoa there, something like that. But giving people an opportunity to change their behavior. And if you don't notice change over time, then have the courage to report it, to go to higher up people, to HR, to not let these things slide. I think we're held to a higher standard as church. And so this is part of earning the trust back from the culture and being seen as that position of authority again, as a trustworthy authority in the community. So just being willing to put our necks out a little bit more when those interactions come up.
Thank you. That is so important to hear. And one wishes we could hear it from the pulpit a little more, as Marcus had referred to, earlier. Mike, what actions would you recommend?
I can only concur with what Regina said. I would add this, that this idea of church being some far off place, we here on this call and all of us are church. And so the responsibility literally lies with us. That goes back to what Regina said, if you see something, say something. We here are the church. And so it's not somebody else's responsibility. It's our responsibility here on this call. Thank you.
Thank you. And that could have been said at the synod, and we have our own little participation synod here as well. Thanks. Thanks very much. And last but not least, Marcus, what would you recommend?
I think this is a tough topic for everyone, regardless of whether they're a parent or a priest or a parish minister. But I think we've got to do what we can to normalize it. Normalize it that you are good, that your body is good, that your sexuality is good, that you don't deserve to be mistreated or made to feel uncomfortable, and neither does anyone else. And so I think if we can reaffirm that goodness and integrate it into the whole of the human person and the whole of the human community, then I think we can better recognize why we have to do exactly what Regina said and call it out. And I think after normalizing it, just reaffirming that I am a safe person for you to talk about with your questions or your concerns, that this is a judgment-free zone where you will be believed, and that again, I might not have all the answers, but we will figure it out together. I just have a quick story. My son is a freshman at an all-boys Catholic high school here in town. And he came to my wife and to me and said he was really uncomfortable with a joke that he heard in his guitar class. It was making light of an adult abusing a minor. It was totally inappropriate joke, but I'm sure that all those teenage boys had no idea what to do or say in that moment. But I was really grateful that my son felt comfortable enough to tell me that the music teacher said this, and I contacted the principal. The principal addressed it with that faculty person that day and thanked me for bringing it to his attention, because these are not laughing matters. These aren't matters that we should be ashamed of or embarrassed about, right? As Mike said, right, this is a responsibility on all of our shoulders to deliver on the inherent and the infinite goodness of every single person.
Thank you. Thank you. So well said. And a lot of courage that your son was able to show. That's great. It's working. That's great. Well, thank you everyone for sharing today. This has been so rich. So as we close, the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work. When we gather, we pray together. So we will end today with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay on to join us in prayer. We know that there are good reasons that some may not choose to stay. If you'd like to sign off now, please know that we wish you peace and goodness, and that we hope to see you again soon. Now, as we begin our closing prayer, let us remind ourselves that, as always, we're in the presence of God, who is love. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that listening is an act of love. Thank you, loving God, for bringing us together this afternoon and giving us the sacred gift of listening to the witness and the wisdom that we have heard today. May we hold each other in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we continue to build this beloved community. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining us today. Go in peace. Goodbye.